Well, I got to tell you, sometimes I think that we run off in directions that are fear-centered or politics-centered before we are educated. And one of the issues where that happens seems to be the one in which we'll discuss in the next few minutes, and that is the issue of transgender. And interestingly, I had a conversation with somebody about this a long time ago, and I remember listening to them talk, and I followed up with what they were saying by asking, how much do you know about being transgendered? And their response was, not much. But they'd formed a lot of opinions or arrived at a lot of conclusions about that, even though the issue had not really been studied. And so I thought maybe that's what we'd try to do today here in this segment, is to set aside the politics of this and just try to understand what that means. And joining us now is Bridget Nolan. She's a limited licensed psychologist and a licensed professional counselor in private practice based in Kalamazoo, and she's going to help us sort through this morning. Bridget, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Richard.
So I'm going to start at the beginning. When somebody says transgender, what does that mean?
So essentially, the term transgender is used to describe a person whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned to them at birth. And so I wanted to kind of explain to people the difference between gender and sex.
Okay.
So sex is kind of the biology, right? The chromosomes, the anatomy, the hormones, things that we're born with. Gender refers to this socially constructed idea of being male or female. So, you know, gender is kind of our unspoken rules, like hairstyle, clothing, traditional job roles, behaviors and actions, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Is it easy for people to make that distinction?
Typically, a person has pretty strong feelings when you ask them about whether or not they identify as a male or a female, a girl or a boy. Even from a young age, most people are able to tell you what they have an inner sense of. Transgender folks have kind of this mismatch in terms of their own internal concepts versus, you know, the sex that they've been assigned at birth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I referred to that conversation I had with that person who said they didn't know much about what it meant to be transgender, but they'd already had all these opinions about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember saying something along these lines. Imagine you're you. This happened to be a male I was talking to. Imagine you're you in a woman's body.
Mm-hmm.
And they just sort of looked at me. Is that a way to cut through the fog and characterize that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you know, people fear the unknown, right? They fear what they don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, you know, the more people talk about and are educated about certain subjects, the more they understand it. And so when you kind of try to put yourself in someone else's shoes, sometimes you can get a better idea of what that person might be experiencing. For example, I work with a lot of adolescents and youth and young adults and families as well. And I had a father once say to me, you know, like, how did this happen? How is my child, you know, who was born a female, telling me that, you know, that they're, you know, not female anymore? And,
right.
You know, one thing I asked, you know, this father to do is, you know, to tell me, like, how did you know that, you know, you were a guy? And he said, well, I just know. And I said, that's, you know, that's kind of similar for, you know, a person that has this inner sense where they just kind of know that that's where they align.
And we'll talk more about that and try and help understand it when the situation is such that the gender we identify corresponds with the body we have. We'll talk about when it isn't that way and how that happens, and how we as folks who don't have that sense can try and understand that when we come back in just a minute. With us this half hour is Bridget Nolan, a psychologist based in Kalamazoo. We're talking about the issue of transgender. So, Bridget, I think you've done a nice job of explaining, as far as I can tell, as well as anyone, what the definition of transgender is. But there's probably some folks listening who can't wrap their minds around that. Okay, so your body is of this sex, but the person in that body identifies with the opposite gender. Mm-hmm. So right. How do you try and explain to people who have trouble understanding what this means?
Sure. Well, so like you mentioned, I'm a therapist. I work at Child and Family Psychological Services here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I talk with a lot of clients and families about the issue of being transgender, and I also talk about it in my personal life, too. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people fear the unknown.
Oh, sure.
And sometimes, as human beings, we just can't understand another person's position. And I think that's okay. There's a certain amount of acceptance that people can have and understand, even if they don't understand exactly what the person is feeling. So I generally try to encourage people to be educated and accepting, even if it's something that they don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is one of those issues that might take some extra diligence to try and understand, even if we don't get all the way there. So talk a little bit, if you would, about someone whom you might meet, and they're trying to sort through this challenge of identifying with one gender but being of the opposite sex. How do you help them through that?
Well, one thing, and I think this can apply to someone who's personally struggling with the issue, or even a family member or a friend that has a loved one that's struggling with the issue of being transgender. I like to relate to human beings and say love is the universal language. Love is something that we all speak, right? So even if we don't completely understand each other, we can understand the desire that human beings have, a need to be loved in the world. And so I talk a lot about acceptance, like how to speak positively about themselves, or, if it's a parent, how to speak positively about their child. Encouraging people to take an active stand, like, against discrimination. And I encourage that to little ones from a young age, too. If you see somebody or hear about somebody being bullied or picked on, to stand up for that person.
Makes sense. So, this is an example of how society has assigned certain roles and expectations of folks, and in this case we may not fit into that, and it's harder for those of us who do fit into that to understand it.
Correct.
So when you meet someone and they're trying to understand where they fit because they are transgendered, how do you help them do that?
Well, a lot of talk therapy.
Yeah.
I think, one of the best things that I try to share with people about therapy is that it's a space where you can be open and honest, and talk about any thoughts or fears you have, and know that you're not going to be judged, know that it's going to be a private space to do that. So really just, I kind of process things out with people, what their thoughts are, what their feelings are. And a lot of people kind of, have, an internal struggle at times about, the idea of even being transgendered,
mm-hmm.
Because it's not easy. Given a choice, most people would do something that's easy or accepting, and being trans is not easy. And so it's a really difficult task. So I try and, really build up people's self-esteem when I'm working with them and let them know that the way they're going to be happiest in life is by loving themselves for who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that process, I presume you uncover whether or not someone feels they need to reassign themselves by way of surgery.
Sure. And some people who are transgender choose the option of surgery, and some don't. And that's really a lengthy and complicated process to get to that point. It's not a decision that's taken lightly by anyone in the professional community. And a lot of times when I have youth that I'm working with, I encourage families to focus on other aspects that they can control and to leave the surgery or the reassignment, if they choose that, till a later date, especially when, someone's transitioned into adulthood.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk more about that in just a second on WBCK. Bridget Nolan is with us, a psychologist based in Kalamazoo. Final few minutes here with Bridget Nolan, psychologist. We've been talking about the issue of transgender and trying to understand it a little bit more without some of the clutter of politics and bathroom talk and all that. And I think, Bridget, that just generally speaking, and you can agree or disagree and tell me for sure, but I get the impression that we're beginning to understand this issue better. Is that true?
Yeah, I believe so, Richard. I think, one of the things that's really helping with that is to talk about it, which is exactly what we're doing this morning. The more people can have open conversation about things like this, the more understanding and accepting we're going to be of this certain issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sense that we're getting better at trying to be open-minded about these things rather than shutting down some things that really might conflict with stuff we've been accustomed to hearing in the past.
Sure. Yeah, and, talking just really kind of demystifies some of the unknown of this, which is a lot of what people fear.
Mm-hmm. So we talked briefly about gender reassignment surgery, and you talked about, particularly for young people, putting that off. But eventually, if a person is of a certain sex but they identify with the opposite gender, can they have a satisfying life without the change of surgery?
Absolutely. I think so. I think it really, that's a personal decision that has to be made. But I think, the more self-acceptance there is, sometimes people feel that the surgery or the reassignment surgery isn't necessary because they're satisfied with who they are and how they fit into society and where they're at in life. So it's all about, finding a space of contentment for yourself.
Somebody's listening to this undoubtedly, and they're touched by this in some way. I presume there are resources that you point people toward if they need them.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are, in our community and surrounding communities, there's so many outpatient private practices. I work for one of those private practices, which is a great organization, very involved in the community. And there's also lots of specific resources, even within the school systems. More and more schools I'm hearing about having, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender support groups or clubs or resource centers. There's a great resource center here in Kalamazoo, the Kalamazoo Gay Lesbian Resource Center. And there's also a really cool organization called PFLAG, which stands for Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And that started back in the 70s, but it's all across the United States. And it helps, families, friends, allies, supporters, and there's PFLAG affiliates in all 50 states here in the country. And really what you're talking about with that is the notion that someone you love may be sort of trying to understand themselves, and you're along for that ride, and so you might need support yourself. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate the help you've given us trying to get us thinking about this in a straightforward way, and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Bridget Nolan is a psychologist with Child and Family Psychological Services in Kalamazoo.